Thanks, Mary. My name is Michael Clifford. I'm the Assistant General Secretary of the Queensland Council of Unions and also an executive member of the TJRyan Foundation. It's great to be here today and great to see all of you here today. Our next speaker is Sally McManus. She probably doesn't need a lot of introduction to most of you, but we'll introduce her nonetheless. So Sally is the 10th Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. She is the first female Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Prior to her other roles in the ACTU, Sally was the Secretary of the Australian Services Union, the New South Wales and ACT branch, where she led a highly successful equal pay campaign for community workers. Since day one in the job of Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Sally has been talking about inequality. She has been putting this issue front and centre. From her very first interview on the 7:30 report, where she said that we need to, at times we should be prepared to break bad laws. And again, that's in the interest of addressing issues like inequality. And since that very first day, she has taken every single opportunity to put this issue front and centre and to talk about the ways that we need to change the rules to make sure that we can address issues of inequality. I'd like you to welcome Sally. Thank you.
I want to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the land and their elders past and present, and Uncle Bob. And thanks, Michael, for the introduction. We're coming to the end of an era, I feel, end of a 30-year era of neoliberalism. The consensus around that neoliberalism is the right approach for society is fractured, as the results of this experiment are really there for all of us to see. Working people were promised more jobs, greater wealth and better services. Privatisation, we were told, would bring greater choice, better products at cheaper prices. But instead, jobs have been outsourced, wages have been cut and prices have gone up as companies extract profits from essential services, especially where they're monopolies. We were promised that trickle-down economics would ensure that the wealth we hand over to the very rich will come back to us. But instead, it seems we cannot rely on the very rich to put limits on their own greed or to share, and they've kept much of that wealth for themselves. The era of deregulation saw protections that generations of working people had fought for stripped from them. In their place, we've seen a concerted, unabashed campaigns to systematically weaken unions, which has left working people with little protections in the face of King Kong-sized power of multinational corporations who have no heart and no sense of obligation to anything other than increasing their profits. And the results? Record low wage growth, and 1 in 4 workers is in insecure work. Now, at the end of this era, inequality is at a 70-year high, and if we continue down the same path, what is left of the rights and protections that made Australia a different place to the United States will be in tatters and will return to the situation of working people more than 100 years ago. Many Australian workers are already there. No job security and poverty-level wages. With this will come broken communities and a broad range of social problems. Is this what we're prepared to accept for our children? So if the ideology of neoliberalism is the cause of record inequality, what should be done? The first thing that needs to occur is recognising that we have a problem so we can diagnose the cause. But Scott Morrison chooses to deny we have a problem with inequality. He actually insists, as you all know, it doesn't exist at all. Perhaps he thinks that his alternative facts will be successful in stopping people from pointing fingers at the real cause. Now let's consider the truth. The most common measure of inequality is income inequality. Income inequality in Australia has been getting worse, despite a blimp just after the GFC when share prices fell for a short period and those rich enough to make lots of income through their investments took a hit. It is clear the general trend in the Gini coefficient has been towards widening income inequality. The last OECD survey of Australia, released in March this year, had this to say about income inequality in Australia. Inclusiveness has been eroded, the Gini coefficient has been drifting up, and households in upper income brackets have benefited disproportionately from Australia's long period of economic growth. Real incomes for the top one quartile of houses grew by more than 40% between 2004 and 2014, while those in the lowest quartile only grew by about 25%. 40% versus 25%. Income inequality has been rising over time, and it's now at a 70-year high. And in particular, the share of income held by the top 1% of the population has been rising steadily since neoliberal approaches began to dominate economic policy in the 1980s. The fact that our government denies inequality is a problem, while traditionally conservative economic institutions, including the OECD and the IMF, argue that rising inequality is the most pressing issue of our time, demonstrates that our government is desperate and it's completely out of touch with reality. Or alternatively, they can never admit that we have a problem with inequality, as people might start pointing the finger at the cause, the neoliberal ideology, as it continues to zealously follow. Whilst the focus has been on income inequality, what is often forgotten, of course, is the wealth inequality is getting worse. Wealth inequality has increased even more sharply than income inequality due to the very rapid rise in the value of homes, investment properties, shares and other assets held by the rich. And amongst the wealthy elite in Australia, it's common to have multi-million-dollar homes, several investment properties and a large portfolio of shares, bonds and other assets. And the benefits seem to multiply the more wealthy you are, as our current tax laws mean you can get out of paying your fair share of tax. At the other end of the income spectrum, many young Australians are struggling to pay the rent, have been forced to move back with their parents, and have very little chance of getting into the housing market. Wealth and income inequality are of course related. The distribution of income has implications for the distribution of wealth and vice versa. High incomes enable the accumulation of a range of wealth holdings on one hand, while large wealth holdings generate high incomes. Over the last decade, the incomes of the already rich rose by almost double that of the poor. The comparison of changes in real wealth is much more dramatic. The real net wealth of the already rich jumped by around 38%, while that of the poor increased by only 4%, 38% versus 4%. The gap between the haves and the have-nots has become a great chasm in the last decade. The disparity in wealth is apparent when we see the top 10 richest Australians have more than $77 billion between them. And it's now true that the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 70% of Australians combined. What's happening to workers? A contributing factor to rising inequality is record low wage growth. Even conservative commentators such as the Governor of the Reserve Bank have argued that this is a highly detrimental factor to the health of the nation. Let's dig deeper. For those workers on enterprise agreements, we see low wage growth, yet productivity is going through the roof. What's going on? The system of enterprise-based bargaining that was meant to deliver increased wages alongside increased productivity is failing. Well, since around 2000, this stopped happening. There was a split between rising wages and EBAs and productivity. People are working harder, they're working smarter, workers are making record profits for their employers, but they're not sharing in it. Even more alarmingly has been the increase in the number of workers on minimum award rates, which has shot up over the last few years from 15.2% in 2010 to 23.9% in 2016. This is a staggering increase in only 6 years. Many of these workers are on or around the minimum wage, which is about $36,000 a year. And below these workers, we now have an underclass of people who are victims of day-to-day wage theft. Casual workers, gig economy workers, and temporary visa workers are now the hyper-insecure who can't just ask for a pay rise and can't even just enforce their rights, their employment rights, as the independent umpire has been stripped of the powers, leaving a system that encourages business models for too many employers that is based on just ignoring our laws. These protections are meant to be there to stop this abuse of power, are just not strong enough anymore. All of this brings us to an alarming decline in the share of national income going to labour. In fact, the share of national income going to labour is at its lowest levels in 50 years. Meanwhile, the share of national income going to profits has increased dramatically since the 1990s. Even the Reserve Bank of Australia, in its latest statement on monetary policy, noticed this disparity. So inequality exists, and it's a serious problem. And it will get worse unless we address the cause. And the cause is the failed ideology of neoliberalism. Let's say it out loud and let's face up to it. So what can we do? We need a new deal. We need to change the rules. We need to put back the protections that have been removed and make sure these protections, the checks and the balances, fit the way businesses organise themselves today. There are two areas where our government can act to start restoring fairness. The first is modernising our tax laws to ensure that everyone pays their fair share of tax. This will ensure that wealth is more fairly distributed and everyone benefits. As the ALP has been proposing, we need to close corporate tax loopholes and tackle unproductive negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions which disproportionately benefit the wealthiest Australians. The government should also reverse its planned $65 billion corporate tax cut. Despite the government's spin, this will not benefit working people or the economy. They are simply handouts to big business, more trickle-down economics. Increased corporate welfare is not used to build new factories, update technology and create more jobs. Rather, a tax-funded jump in corporate profits will end up in the pockets of corporate executives or all too often offshore shareholders. The second way our government can act is to bring about better and stronger rights at work for working people that accounts for the way businesses now organise themselves. There are 4 priority areas here. First of all, more secure jobs by taking away the incentives to casualise work. Secondly, restoring a strong, fair and independent industrial umpire. Thirdly, ensuring a level playing field in bargaining. And finally, rebuilding a relevant, modern and strong safety net for all workers. Industrial laws have always existed with one primary purpose, that is to address the inherent power imbalances that exist between capital and labour. That imbalance has never been greater. Our laws need to change to do their job. Finally, unions are an essential element to keeping inequality in check. It will not be enough to strengthen the support for individual workers if we do not also strengthen the support for their collective voice unions. The union bashing must stop. The laws that made the job of unions harder and harder must be addressed. It is in the interest of all Australians that we have a strong union movement. We have the harshest laws in the OECD against unions. Only in parts of the US are the laws equally harsh. Australian unions operate in an environment of no support and continual vicious attacks. Union members win the increases to award wages and to agreements. Yet we receive no institutional support and many people benefit from our work without contributing to the costs. It is like having to give away a product for free. If the same situation existed for companies, where they developed and produced something and then had to give it away for free, they would not survive. Our society needs unions, but due to this problem, commonly called the free rider problem, we have a market failure. We cannot forever provide this vital service to the whole of our society while relying on an even smaller group of workers to fund this activity. Our activity, which is about increasing wages and building a strong economy, ultimately benefits every single Australian. Every other country in the OECD recognises this situation and finds ways to support their unions. In Australia, we need to build that recognition and develop the supports to keep unions to be able to lift wages and improve our economy. This is part of the new deal that we need. We need to accept that the era of neoliberalism is ending and our governments need to act to reform tax laws and our labour laws to bring fairness back to Australia. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Thank you very much, Sally. The roving mics are roving again, so Sally's very happy to answer questions. So there's the first person here, and there's someone here. Thank you. To start.
Thank you. I'd like to ask, has the ACTU or the ALP ever looked at introducing a financial transactions tax, which is a tax on stocks, bonds, currencies and derivatives when they're traded?
I can't speak for the Labor Party, but I can for the union movement. It's part of our policy. It's been debated amongst all of our unions, and it's part of what we would like to see happen.
That's very good if you do.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to ask about the issue you raised about the so-called free riders in the, taking the benefits of pay rises without paying their union fees. How do you think you can address that issue?
Yeah. So this is a not a straightforward solution to this issue, and we've got to remember a few things about our history as well. It's not as if we didn't have ways to address this in Australia, and we're not now advocating these, but just to remind everyone, when we had 53% union membership, that came on the basis of a whole lot of institutional supports. For example, there were clauses in awards that gave preference to union members in employment and in promotion. They got taken out of our industrial instruments in the Howard era, the beginning of John Howard. And I remember in my union when that happened, pretty much overnight, whole union memberships in the shipping industry, for example, collapsed as bosses sent out, letters to their workers saying, sign this and we'll stop your union dues. There's been other ways we've approached this as well in industrial instruments as a way of saying, well, if like bargaining fees or, for example, allowances to access dispute settlements procedures, all sorts of different ways. Other countries have other ways of dealing with this. So in Canada and other parts of the world, there's votes that workers will have over whether or not they want to bargain collectively or they want to have a union. And if a majority vote, well, then everyone becomes a member or everyone contributes. So that's a recognition that everyone benefits, they should pay. In other countries, obviously, there's tripartite systems that operate in Europe, and there's institutional supports and recognition of the role of unions given. Some countries, they fund the role of unions to do these negotiations. Other countries, they unions tie parts of social security to union membership. So we think that this is one of the main reasons why we have 15% union membership compared to like countries. It's not because our union movement's less active. It's not because we're not good at what we do. It's because we actually are operating in a different environment, an open shop environment. For us as a union movement, this is an important issue, but we also know that there's many other important issues. There's insecure work and there's the low wage growth. And so on our list of priorities, this is on the list of priorities, but it's not before the other ones. So we at the moment are going through a process of looking at what has existed or what does exist in other countries, what's existed in our country, and what would be the best and the fairest way to go about addressing this problem. So it's a long way of saying that we recognise that there's no straightforward answer to this, and that there's work that we need to do in order to advance the argument as well as to come up with a good solution.
Thank you. Good morning, Sally, and thanks for coming. I was trying to think of how I was going to start, but basically I've been in the unions for over 30 years. I'm in two at the moment, the Australian Service Union and the AWU. The reason why is to get across help, but in the last few years, I should say, in the last 20, 30 years, raising a family, basically what we have won in the unions has been excellent, but that's been going away. And in the last few years, myself working in the community services area, I've lost a couple of jobs, and also I'm usually the only union person in organisations because I've been trying to get the rights for workers all the time. So I understand exactly what you're saying about with unions being attacked by even religious organisations running community services.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen a bit of that myself.
Yes, gentleman there, and then there's a couple of people over there, that side there.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. It's good to hear you discussing wealth. Here.
Oh, thanks.
Good to hear you discussing wealth. Just going back 43, 44 years, just to give you an example on housing. I was a bank clerk, 24 years of age, salary $5,500 a year, living in a house in Taringa. 3 times my salary would buy that house.
Yeah.
So 3 times $5,500 would buy me a 3-bedroom, 2-year-old house in Taringa for $16,500. Now, a bank officer these days is on about $75,000 a year.
Yep.
He's 10 times his salary to even get near a property like that.
Yep.
At that time, I had savings in my ANZ savings account of $5,500, which equalled my annual salary. It was just bizarre. What's gone wrong?
Well, I'm sure there's lots of people here who've been talking about, that particular issue, but just to think about the consequences, there's a huge generational break that's happening, and everyone under the age of basically my age and younger is now in this situation where your expectations about what life will be like and owning a house, having a secure job, all the basic foundations of security have been eroded. And I think we need to think about the rise of the likes of Pauline Hanson. I think we need to take lessons too from the US, where people are in a situation where they say, well, we expected life in Australia to be like this, and now it's not, and it's happened very rapidly, and those expectations are not going to be met, and there's a gap between how we thought life was going to be like and how it actually is like. And so whether you're the parents of those children or whether you're, in that situation yourself, you're going to be asking those questions. And someone is going to fill that gap and give those explanations. I've just given an explanation, but it's a very different explanation to what Pauline Hanson is saying. Like, she's saying it's because of immigration and Muslims and, cultural undermining rather than economic undermining. So the issue you raise is really, really pertinent, and I don't think we should underestimate the resentment that's going to build amongst a younger generation of people.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. Yes, I want to know what you think you could do about what I think is one of the biggest problems, or growing problems, which is the use of subcontractors, quasi labour, and it's usually under the counter. I know you're talking about getting a fair and balanced regulator in there again, but it's a high cost, difficult task, so you need probably something more than inspectors going around, because there's just so many places, particularly when the people most victimised by this are often newly arrived immigrants and whatever, on sham contracts, probably working for $5, $10 or less an hour to do huge jobs. So
let's talk about two things: insecure work, and then secondly remind me to talk about enforcement and why is it that we're seeing all of this just not following our laws at all. With insecure work, we've got this proliferation of fake casuals, fake contractors, rolling contracts that never end, and people not being in secure work because of that. So we used to have in our industrial laws a proper definition of what a casual is, but really it's actually a proper definition of what a permanent job is. So casuals, of course, are meant to be there to fill short-term needs with no expectation of ongoing employment. Now, because our industrial laws took away those fairly straightforward, universally accepted definition of what a casual is, employers are able to go around and just label someone a casual even if they're not. And of course the consequences of that are all the things we know. You can't get a home loan, you can't have base security, you're constantly worried about losing your job, and your employer has heaps of power because they can just get rid of you because you're a casual. So fixing that, we don't have to go and look overseas. So we just need to restore what we used to have, a proper definition of what a casual worker is. The issue of contractors, we also used to have a system that fairly quickly and easily was able to declare a contract unfair and to deal with sham contracting arrangements. Our laws have changed so that that is now an extremely expensive, long process where last week a cleaner in Melbourne turned up to do her job. she was told, and she'd been doing that job for 20 years, she was told, when you come back for the next shift, come back with an ABN, because now you're going to be an ABN worker. Oh, but don't worry, your rate of pay is going to be higher. So that cleaner who'd had a secure job is now expected to be their own business and pay their own tax, workers' compensation, everything, of course, and in the end is getting a lower rate of pay. But once you work through all of that. Now, why do we have a system that allows that? Why do we have a system that doesn't make it easy for working people to quickly and efficiently enforce what their rights are, and strong enough rights in the first place? It's because our laws have changed, and when work choices came in, so many of those protections were pulled away. When we got rid of work choices, we put a whole lot of those protections back in, but the ones we did put in aren't strong enough to deal with the current situation, or we haven't put some of the other key protections back in. Now go to the issue of enforcement. It used to be that the industrial umpire had the power to enforce agreements, enforce awards, fairly quickly and easily award underpayment claims. It also used to be that unions were able to go and inspect the wages in the cafe down the road fairly easily as well. And so employers had in the back of their mind, the chances of us being caught, yes, there's a chance of that, and if we get caught, we're going to have to pay the money back, and it's just not worth it. Now, why is it that you've got Domino's Pizza or celebrity chefs just doing it? Because they can get away with it. And if they get caught, the poor worker has to go to the federal court just to get, let's just say they didn't get paid for a Saturday shift. So let's say it's worth $200, which would be a lot of money for a worker in a, celebrity chef kitchen washing dishes, right? That worker would have to get a lawyer, would have to go to the federal court, would have to go through, be forced into conciliation for a while. It will go on and on and on. They're probably a casual worker as well. Do you think they're going to last at that place? And after they've spent all that money on lawyers, maybe eventually they'll get their $200 back. But, they're going to add it up, aren't they? Is it worth my job, and is it worth all the money? So we've got to change the system so the independent umpire can enforce our basic rights. That will, I think, make a huge difference to this underclass that's developed, that we've allowed to develop because we've just allowed our rights to be something that aren't enforced.
I think there was someone else just in there too. Yes.
Thanks. That follows on with my question regarding enforcement.
Yep.
and fighting back to retain or regain an independent umpire and good
Yep.
regulation. And you referred to the Unfair Work Commission.
Yes.
Yes.
No, I didn't say that. You said that.
I said it. Well, I'll say it loud because this week the Unfair Work Commission agreed that Murdoch University could terminate its enterprise bargaining agreement. This has implications for so many other.
Every single worker on an enterprise agreement.
That's right. And I'm hoping that there is a really good campaign to come to see that there is a Fair Work Commission, or what we can.
There's
how
two
we can be
issues
involved.
there. We can't entirely blame the Fair Work or the people on the Fair Work Commission. It's actually the laws. However, there are two things working together. The Turnbull government and the Abbott government before that have been systematically stacking that commission. They have been making our institutions full of bosses, and not just any bosses, ideological ones that are there to do a job and would like on their gravestone written, I have taken rights off workers all my life. And so, we had, the convention was that you'd replace people with, someone with a union background, someone with an employer background, someone, an academic or a public sector workers, or someone with other expertise. They ignore that, and now they've stacked it. So that's a problem, because if we want an independent umpire, it has to be independent. So that does need to be addressed. The issue about Murdoch University is a huge one. It's not the first to happen. It started actually here in Queensland with Horizon, and it's gone throughout our laws. That was the precedent, and now what's happened is you've got really anti-union law companies that have worked out the formula for employers to now follow in order to guarantee the cancellation of their agreements. So, it's a little bit more complicated, but actually It's not really. Basically, serve your workers with a claim that they'll never accept. So, pay cuts. Drag out the negotiations for as long as possible. Just sit there, don't worry about it, don't agree to anything. Then make an application to terminate your agreement. And the way our laws work at the moment, because of the weakness in the base law and then the precedents, is that yes, the court will cancel agreements. Now, how serious is this? This is an absolute threat to bargaining as we know it. Like, how can we have a system which is based on enterprise-based bargaining where one side is going to have all the power? It just makes a joke and a mockery of it, and it does threaten even the existence of the idea of enterprise bargaining. And it's coupled with the problem that unions have not been able to move our safety net, because we've got two ways the safety net now works. One is through a national employment standards, which are legislated rights, and the other one is awards. Awards are no longer creatures of unions. Like, we used to own those awards, be party to those awards, be able to move them. Now they're administrative instruments of the Commission. That's what they are legally, and we're just an interested party. Anyone could be an interested party. You could be, and make an application to do this or do that. But it's so hard to move those awards, impossible in fact, to keep up with what's happening in the market or community standards. So essentially you've got these instruments that are now 20 years old, because that's how long we've been bargaining. We've been told, don't worry, the future is enterprise bargaining, so you don't need to really worry about this, especially in the university sector, because everyone's going to be on agreements, so you don't need to have to worry about this relic of the past. And we've gone about bargaining. Like, I don't know, in the university sector, you're probably up to your 12th agreement. That's a long time. That's 20 years plus of bargaining. It's gone up and up and up. There's been compromises made. There's been trade-offs. There's been working out what's right for the employer and workers at individual universities. Rates of pay and conditions are up here. So there's a 30% gap, redundancy payments, everything between that and what the awards are. And so you can see the interaction of, what's going on. The incentive then for the employer to go about cutting that, to give them an extraordinary amount of power. I can't even say unfair. There must be a word that's stronger than unfair. What? Yeah.
Yes, some people here, yes.
Thank you. There's been a bit of discussion, especially when you're talking a little bit earlier about housing affordability, specifically in relation to young people. And I know that a lot of discussions here about enterprise bargaining agreements and union award rates often flies over the heads of a lot of young people, just inherently because they haven't had a serious employment. So obviously they wouldn't understand these things practically, or have too much relation to people that have been engaged with things like this. But we can see that in Australia specifically, we've had kind of historically, at the moment, historically low rates of political membership for young people, or even engagement with politics in general with young people. Whereas that's not the same with other countries like in the US or the UK or European countries, where there's a lot more involvement with young people. What do you think the problem is specifically in Australia that means that young people feel disengaged from the political system or the union system? And what do you think the carryover effects are, and how do you think we can change that specifically in Australia?
I didn't know there was evidence to say that our young people are less politically engaged than the ones in the US. Let's just say that's true, okay? Because I don't know if it is or not, but let's just say it's true. 100,000 people just enrolled to vote in that survey that we're facing. That's not very disengaged, I'd say. But I often hear people say, the younger generation, they're just not, as politicised or unionised or supportive as unions as it was when I was young. That really drives me crazy, because when you listen to those people, when they were young, we had those institutional supports. And I say to them, when you joined the union, how'd you join the union? Everyone was in the union in my workplace. I said, well, did you fill in a form? How did it all happen? Well, everyone was in the union and the employer encouraged it. Or we had delegates, everyone did it, we just all were. In fact, most people can't even remember filling in that membership form because of those institutional supports I talked about before. So what happens, you've got the same depoliticised young person back in the 70s who becomes a union member, not through really a conscious choice actually, they become a member. Then what happens, you get politicised through the process of being in that. And so I think that young people are a product of the environment that they're currently in, where that's no longer happening. So to say that they're less supportive of unions, well, they don't have experience of them, as you point out. And part of all of those reasons are because of, they're no longer working in workplaces where a union exists. And so people learn about, what it is, what a collective is, how, about unequal bargaining power and the collective through actually experiencing it, not through being told, because it makes no sense if you just get told, does it? Because what experience do we have in our lives where we act collectively? One of the few ones is actually in a union. So I think all of these things are interacting, and what do we do about it? I think that the fight over secure jobs is, and low wage growth for that matter, are things that are going to disproportionately benefit young people. So there needs to be simple language used to talk about this, not because young people are simple, but just take away all the jargon. Really, it's just about being able to have a future like anyone else. And we as trade union movement have got to go about inspiring young people to be part of a movement that's going to bring about real change. It's going to change the rules so that they're going to have the same opportunities that their parents had.
Hi, Sally. Speaking of the Fair Work Commission, I was unfortunate enough to get injured at work and was sacked 2 weeks later. Went to the Fair Work Commission, and I was working for a multinational at the time. The multinational actually more or less used the Fair Work Commission as a way of getting out of any rehabilitation costs, etc., because you can't receive any compensation for being sacked at the same time you're receiving workers' compensation.
Yeah.
And I looked into it, and there's a hell of a lot of times where this is actually happening. And we speak about the inequality, etc. You walk into what's supposed to be a Fair Work Commission saying that it's going to give you a fair go. You're sitting at a desk where across from you is a barrister, a solicitor, 2 HR managers and 2 secretaries doing all the paperwork. So that is one place where inequality still reigns and is actually getting larger as that commission keeps on expanding, as you said, unfortunately, with people that are stacked in it to ensure that there is no fair work.
So you're absolutely right about that. We used to deal with this problem in Australia to make sure that people had a fair go when they went to the independent umpire by stopping lawyers, like making it a no lawyer jurisdiction, so that the worker and their union, if they're in a union, deals directly with the employer without the complicated legal processes or arguments that are always going to be stacked against us as working people. Secondly, we had a situation where the Commission could resolve disputes on their merits. So that was the principle, and that's the way that they could make orders on their merits. When I started as a union official, and I think I'm sort of like the last of, people that operated under those systems, so you can really tell the total difference between that old way that things worked, where there was an element of fairness. Didn't mean we won all the time. We still call it the boss's court, but compared to now, I'd have that any day. Compared to what we've got now, so many unions now just know there's just no point even going down to the Commission, because usually they've got no power under the law to make a decision. They can only conciliate. Why is the boss going to conciliate if they know that there's no threat to that they can make a decision? So half the time they don't even turn up, or if they do, they just go through the process knowing in the end the worker's got no power. So in order to bring back fairness and deal with the situation we've now got with inequality, these are like key solutions that have worked well in Australia before that we need to bring back in order to get over the problems you're talking about.
A couple more questions. There was a gentleman down the back here. A couple of people have asked before, so gentleman down the back here, Steph.
Where, sorry? Okay. Yep.
Thanks for your speech, Sally. My question goes back a couple of questions. I accept that looking at the erosion of working conditions and the work of the Ombudsman, etc., and trying to bring back some of those regulatory frameworks to an appropriate level. I think Howard used to say the pendulum has swung. Well, it swung way too far.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether that will be that useful in the future with the rise of, for example, P2P, the gig economy type employment arrangements, which by all accounts technology is going to allow to happen. It's happening overseas. It's happening here to some extent. Airtasker, Freelancer, Upwork. It's happening in services with Uber and other things that do other types of services. How do we... Is the ACTU working on ways that we can regulate that kind of work to ensure, a basic set of entitlements in a sort of gig economy?
Yes, thanks for that question. I don't want what I've put forward to look as though really what we're asking for is, a system that existed beforehand. What I'm really saying is there's concepts in there that we know worked very well for a period of time that could be put in the current environment, but we also need to build a system that is appropriate to the 21st century and ways that businesses organise themselves, and that's going to take a different type of creativity. It also, in a way, means we've got to build a system that's flexible enough to change over time as well. So sometimes the over-regulation of things, for example, enterprise bargaining, is the most, like on one hand, the Conservatives will say they're totally against regulation, except when it comes to us, when it comes to unions and working people. So at the moment, the only place where working people can create rights isn't at the National Employment Standards, that's the government of the day. It's not at awards, because as I pointed out, we can no longer do that. It's only at the level of enterprise-based bargaining, and that's the most highly regulated process that you're ever going to have to go through. What you can bargain about, who you can bargain with, how you go about putting in your claims. Then when it gets to taking protected industrial action, if you want to, like all the hoops like there. In a way, we want that freed up and to be able to, workers to be able to bargain where the actual power is. So if your direct legal employer isn't the person who really makes the decisions, if it's someone else up the supply chain, workers should be able to bargain with who's got the power, and that can change over time. So we need to build a system that does that. In the case of gig economy workers, we're not opposed to technology. In fact, we like technology where it liberates people, and the development of apps that allow things to happen, like with Uber or Airtasker, there's nothing bad in itself with that. But where it's used to avoid rights, there is. So we just want to do the same thing we've always done, take wages out of competition. So why should it be that a worker who's a gig economy worker not get the basic national employment standards? Why shouldn't they apply to all working people, regardless of how they're defined, under an old way of seeing things? Like, at least then we'd make sure that all workers have basic protections, and that, yes, have your technology, but the competition on wages can't go below a certain point. And I think that's a really key important thing that we need to do to ensure that we don't just develop a whole group of working poor, overworked working poor, simply because they're just not even operating with any set of regulations or laws or fairness.
Lucky last question, Michael, back to you.
Thanks very much, Mary, and I know we've only got 2 minutes to go, so I wonder if very quickly, the Fin Review reported this week that there's $17 billion in superannuation that hasn't been paid to workers. So you've already talked about wage theft. I wonder if you could quickly talk about the union movement's view about how we address stolen superannuation as well.
Yeah, so stolen superannuation or deferred wages, like wages of workers that are just deferred, is a huge issue and not enough talked about, and we're going to start talking about it a lot more. Mechanisms for addressing that, well, it goes to some of the issues we've already been talking about. We've been thinking about lifting super and not having it just in one act, but also in the Fair Work Act, and strengthening the enforcement provisions that we talked about, so it's quick and easy for working people to be able to recover money that's been stolen off them, like as a principle. And because this has become such a big problem, it's becoming more urgent that it get addressed.
Well, thank you very much, Sally.
No
You've
worries.
given us lots to think about.
Thank you. Cheers.
And a little something.